for the presence of everyone here this morning. I encourage you to take your Bibles out and follow along with me over the next few moments as we study from God's Word, to test what I have to say, to see that it be the truth, and that we can take and make practical application in our everyday walks of life, and we can leave here better servants of God in the future than we've been in the past. We've been trying over the last couple of months, 4 months, to have at least one, if not multiple studies, trying most weeks, but at least once a month, typically twice a month, to have something from our Bible reading. And I was going through this week's Bible reading, and the New Testament reading was the book we were studying at the exact same time, which made it kind of difficult to choose I thought I was going to choose a New Testament one as I was moving through, and that was going to make it difficult. But then I got to thinking about the fact that the home is a topic that, while Ephesians 5 is probably the primary passage we use, there is much the Bible has to say about the home and about the relationships within the home. And so I got to thinking about the home and talking about that, and then I got to thinking about the way that our society wants to paint a picture of the home. You look at our society and the way they would have the home depicted and the way they think it ought to look. And they would tell you, that the roles that we would say that God has given are outdated and those don't apply anymore. They would try to change what constitutes or who makes up a relationship right in the eyes of God. And so they try to paint this picture of the home, and they try to paint an improper picture of the home. But what we want to look at this morning is the picture of the home, but we don't want to look at the picture of the home as painted by society, as painted by some polls, as painted by some religious institution. But what's the picture of the home that's painted by God in the Scriptures? What does God have to say? What's the picture He paints as to how the home should look? Well, before we get into any of the roles that are given to the husband and the wife, we have to begin with where it all began in the home, and that is that the picture of the home painted by God is one man and one woman for life. You know, our society would have us, does not respect the marriage relationship as painted by God, and not just the roles that we'll get to later on. They don't respect the institution of marriage. Our society would tell us that a marriage can be between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. That's how they want to have our society painted. It can be, they want to have, they legalized homosexuality. I think it was something like 12 years ago now. And so, this is how the home can be, and this is what society wants to say. But not only does society try to paint it as in the homosexual relationship, they don't respect the permanence of marriage between a man and a woman either. The fact is that our society treats marriage more like it's dating than an sacred institution created by God. You look at the divorce rate, I think the divorce rate is somewhere around 50%. And what's happening in our society is that there is no longer respect for marriage. By the way, several years ago, a study came out when I was living in Arkansas, and something was said about Arkansas had like the second highest divorce rate in the country, or the first highest among the states, and California had the lowest. And I thought for a second, that just doesn't seem quite right with what we know about them. But then somebody pointed out, and it's true, the reason the divorce rates in places like that are so low, and by the way, the reason I think divorce rates are probably declining or staying where they are, not increasing even more, is that there's no respect for the marriage relationship as a whole. People will just live together now without getting married. And then, if they do get married, often 50% of those end in divorce, but a lot are just not getting married. But they're acting as if they're married, but they're not married, so that doesn't count towards the divorce rate. And again, that comes back to a lack of respect for God's marriage and the sexual relationship within the marriage relationship in Hebrews 13:4. But specifically talking about the way they treat it like dating, when people do get married nowadays, it's almost as if I get married, but if it doesn't work out, I'll just get a divorce. And our society will get a divorce. In our society, people will get a divorce for any and every reason. And so Our society does not respect the marriage relationship as painted by God. It doesn't like, it'll tell us that marriage can be between two men or two women. It'll tell us that marriage between a man and a woman is not necessarily permanent. What's the picture painted by God? Well, let's go to Matthew 19. Let's see what Jesus said when he was asked about marriage. In Matthew chapter 19, Jesus is asked in verse 3, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any cause? So, we're not going to get all this morning. There's a time and a place for us to get into a detailed study of divorce and marriage, divorce, and remarriage. But some questions say that he's asking about remarriage. He was never asked about remarriage. He was asked about who has the right to divorce in the first place. Can they divorce for just any cause? That was a question that was asked. Can they divorce, as our society has it often today, for irreconcilable differences? Can they divorce because, he didn't do what she asked him to do around the house? Or can they divorce because she burnt the biscuits? Or whatever reason you want to throw in there. Can they divorce for just any cause? Here was Jesus' reply, verse 4. Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? Now, the passage in Genesis, we're not going to go to Genesis this morning, but I would encourage you to write those down. These are what Jesus is talking about in Genesis 2, 21 and 25. When he says, have you not read? He's talking about that passage in Genesis 2. From the beginning, when God had made man, and then he wanted to make a helper fit for him, he made woman. He made one woman for Adam. What that tells me is, first and foremost, the marriage relationship is between man and woman. He didn't make Adam another man. He made him a woman, a helper fit for him. But not only did he make woman, he made but one. He made them male and female. There was one man and one woman. What that implies is there was one man and one woman, and it was expected to be for life. So what was Jesus' answer when he was asked, can man divorce for any cause? Have you not read that in the beginning, he that made them male and female? Here's the second thing he said. The two are joined, or the two become one flesh, verse 4 through 6. And said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. I mentioned this the other day when we were in Ephesians. This was talked about in Ephesians of being one flesh. We often talk about this in terms of the sexual relationship, and that is a part. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 would tell us that. But it is far more than just the sexual relationship. It is the blending of two lives into one. You can take any number and divide it down further. You want to take 2, you can divide it into 1. You have 1 plus 1, right? You can divide it down further. You take a number like 3, and you can have 3 ones, or a 2 and a 1. You can have any combination of numbers. 1 is the only number not divisible down any further, without getting into decimals, but in terms of perfectly round numbers. It's the only number not divisible down any further. And when 2 become 1, there is no dividing that down. That is intended to be a permanent relationship. Not only that, I was getting ahead of myself. This should have been the second point. Go back to verse 5. They are joined, or they are glued together. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother. That is, he leaves that relationship as he knows it. We'll talk about the relationship between parent and child later on. But when one becomes an adult and they leave and they get married, they leave that relationship with father and mother as they have known it, and he is joined to his wife. Thayer says that means to glue upon or to glue to. When you glue something, you know what you're intending? You're intending for the glue to hold. And what he says is, when man and woman are married, they are glued together, or they are cemented together. It is expected to be a permanent relationship. And then finally, they shall not separate. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Here's something we need to understand about the marriage relationship. Not only does it not separate, we talk about verse 5, they are glued, cemented, joined together. That's not done by man. That's done by God. What therefore God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. A man may stand at the front in a wedding ceremony and make some remarks and then have them exchange some vows. That person is just performing a ceremony. That's not the person joining them. It's God that joins them together because they have the right to be married to one another. And what God has joined together, let not man separate. And that's exactly what our society has tried to do, is take that marriage relationship, that sacred institution created by God, and tried to separate. You see, what we need to understand is the picture God paints of the home is one man and one woman. There should be one man and one woman for life. What's the picture of the home painted by God? Well, it begins with understanding that the picture of the home painted by God is one man and one woman for life. It's to be a permanent relationship. But what about with a picture that he paints within that relationship? When one man and one woman are joined for life, that they may have a right to be married to one another and they may stay together, but they still have roles that need to be filled. What is that picture of the home? Well, the picture of the home painted by God involves a husband who, first and foremost, is the head of the wife. In Ephesians chapter 5 and in verse 23, where we've been just recently, we're there just Wednesday. In Ephesians chapter 5 and in verse 23, it says, "For the husband is the head of the wife." Now, he's not a dictator. This, and then the wife's counterpart to that we'll get to in a moment, she's to be submissive, is one of the things our society spends the most time attacking. And that it's an outdated role, that he's the head and she's to be submissive. Listen, him being a head does not mean that he's a dictator, and that's the picture that's tried to paint. He's somebody that leads with love. We'll come back in a minute and talk about the love he's to have, but the two are closely connected. He's not a dictator that says, you know what, here's what I want, and here's how we're going to do it, and that's just going to be how it's going to be, and I don't care how you feel, and I don't care how you think. That's not what it means for him to be the head of the wife. He may be the one making the decisions and things, but here's somebody that he's going to consult her and see how she feels about something. He's going to see how she feels. He's going to be somebody that's not just insistent on his own way. His decisions in being the head and in leading, a true leader that loves the people he leads is looking out for their best interest. And so as the head, he's not somebody that's just insisting on his own way and this is how it's going to be. He's trying to look out for the best interest of those he leads. He's trying to do what's best for his wife and for his children. A husband is to be the head of the wife. He's to be the leader. Not only is he to be a leader, he's to be somebody that loves her. Look again at Ephesians 5, beginning at verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. Love her, and love her as Christ loved the church. That's a sacrificial love. Verse 2 of the same chapter in Ephesians 5. And walk in love as Christ has loved us and given himself for us. Verse 25 would go on and talk about Christ giving himself as well. Now this means first and foremost, when we deal with the ultimate application of this, if it came down to it, he would give himself for her. Right? That's to have that sacrificial love. Christ gave himself for the church. And a man that truly loves his family is going to be willing to protect them, even if that means at the sake of his own life. And so if he has to give himself to protect her, he loves her enough to do so. But it's not just in actually giving his life. He's willing to give up some of his desires for hers if that's what he needs to do. We're not talking about him giving up being the head of the household. We're not talking about him not trying to make the best decisions. But if there's something where maybe it's something where, just as an illustration, it may be ridiculous, when they decide to paint the house. And so she wants to paint it light blue and he wants to paint it green. And he's not going to say, well, you know what, I'm the head of the house and I'm going to paint it how I want to paint it and I don't care how you feel. What he's going to do, if he really loves her, say, you know what, let's go ahead and do it your way. That's a sacrificial love in application. And odds are, if we take the numbers, the men here, odds are you're not going to have to give your life to protect the sake of your wife, but you are going to have to be willing to give some of your desires up for her desires and be willing to compromise out of love. That's what sacrificial love would demand of us. But it's not just a sacrificial love. It's loving her as he loves himself. Verse 28. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. I said this on Wednesday. I believe it was Matthew Henry, the commentator, that said this. A man's children are pieces of himself, but a man's wife is himself. Again, that goes back to the two becoming one. And so, he loves her, being one flesh, he loves her as he loves himself. For, verse 29, no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. And so he would love and nourish and cherish her. He cares for her, and he provides for her needs, provides for the things she needs in life, and takes care of her, because he loves her as he loves himself. He would take care of himself, and so he loves and cares for and takes care of her. This results from an understanding that the two are one. Again, verse 29, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. He's using that parallel of Christ and the church. So verse 30 is explaining that relationship between the church and Christ. But come back to verse 31. For we are members of his body, of his flesh and bones. For this reason, verse 31. Now we're coming back to the marriage relationship. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And so, when he understands they're one flesh, he will love her as he loves himself. What does he need to do? What's the picture painted by God of the home? Well, the picture of the home painted by God involves a husband who's head of the wife, who loves her and will dwell with understanding. Go to 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter 3. And the passage that Gabe read for us earlier in 1 Peter 3 and in verse 7, it says, husbands likewise dwell with your wives with understanding, giving honor to her as to the weaker vessel. What that would involve is understanding her needs and making sure that her needs are met. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and in verse 3, it says, let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. Now, the specifics of 1 Corinthians 7 is dealing with the sexual relationship, but it goes far beyond the reach of that in terms of giving what's due. There was a book written several years ago by I believe his last name was Harley, who was a marriage counselor for years, and he wrote a book entitled His Needs and Her Needs. And I'd encourage couples to go through that book. There's a lot of stuff in there that you can learn from it. And what he does is he takes the 10 most basic needs and divides them the 5 most common for men and the 5 most common for women. While he uses some scripture in there, there's some basis in scripture that's there as to why I think it's a good material I'd recommend somebody to read. But one of the things that he points out, and one of the things that I think we learn from 1 Peter 3:7, is that part of dwelling with understanding is understanding her needs and meeting them, and then understanding that they're different. Men and women are different. I know our society doesn't want us to think that, but men and women are different. And so her needs are different from his needs. What are the 5 most common needs for men? Are the 5 least common of that list of 10 for women. Most often. They can sometimes be interchangeable. But generally speaking, what's most important to him is least important to her. What's most important to her is least important to him. And so what that requires in the marriage relationship is having an understanding and making sure that he meets her needs, and then understanding her emotions are different. Men and women's emotions are different. That's just a fact. I know our society wants to tell us there's not much difference between men and women, but clearly society doesn't spend much time around both men and women to not understand that there are differences between men and women. And part of the role of a man in dwelling with understanding is to understand those differences and learn how to meet her needs, and understanding her emotions are different. And just because he views it one way, maybe he thinks something's minor, that's not a big deal, but it may be to her, and he needs to be understanding in that. What is the picture of the home painted by God? It involves the husband that's the head of the wife, loves the wife, who dwells with her with understanding, who gives honor to her, verse 7. Or 1 Peter 3, that should be. 1 Peter 3:7 again. Husbands likewise dwell with your wives in an understanding way, giving honor to her. Giving honor to her, it says, as to the weaker vessel, and giving honor to her as fellow heirs. Your fellow heirs together. And so, give honor to her. Honor the role that she fills as a wife. Honor the role she fills as a mother. And the role that she meets. And she's meeting her responsibilities. There's honor to be bestowed upon her for the things that she has done. So what's the picture of the home painted by God? Well, it involves one man and one woman for life. It involves a husband who's a leader, who's loving, who dwells with understanding, and who gives honor to the wife. It involves a wife who, first and foremost, submits to her husband. Stay in 1 Peter 3. I'll quickly read Ephesians chapter 5, and I encourage you to write these down. But we're going to come back and go in a little more detail in 1 Peter 3 in a minute. But in Ephesians 5:22, it says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord." 1 Peter 3, 1 and 2, a similar point. Now, there's two things to note that first and foremost about this submission is it is as to the Lord in verse 22. She submits to her husband as she submits to the Lord. And then, secondly, it's in everything, verse 24. "Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let wives be to their own husbands in everything." There's been this general thought that he's head of her only when it pertains to spiritual things. But that's not the point that the Scriptures make. He tells her, Paul writes in Ephesians 5:24, to be subject in everything. In fact, and that's why I want to go back to 1 Peter 3 in some detail here for a minute. Be subject to him, even if he does not obey the truth. Now, that doesn't mean when if he tries to keep her from services, she needs to stay home. That's not what it means. She can't compromise truth. Okay, that's not what we're talking about. But she has to respect his role as the head and be subject to him in things as long as it doesn't conflict with the will of God, even if he does not obey the truth. Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands. And even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. Even if he's not what he needs to be, that doesn't remove her role. Even if he's not a Christian, that doesn't remove her role of being submissive. It's still given to her. In fact, her submission to him might win him over to the Lord when he observes her chaste conduct, accompanied by fear. And so she needs to be submissive as to the Lord, submissive in everything, and even if he does not obey the truth. But here's something I want us to focus on in a minute for 1 Peter 3. That submission is how one is to be so properly adorned. Go to 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3. I want you to notice what he says here. He says first and foremost in verses 4 and 5 that you should not be adorned with just the outward person, but adorned with the hidden person of the heart. Look at verse 3 beginning. "Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, and putting on fine apparel." Let me stop there for a second. He's not saying there's nothing wrong if a woman wants to wear jewelry or fix her hair or anything. What he's saying is don't let your focus be on the outward, right? Rather, verse 4, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. Let it be the hidden person of the heart. Okay, so the adornment needs to be the hidden person of the heart. How does that take place? Well, he says, and by the way, he points out in verse 5, "For in this manner, in former times, the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves." The women of old adorned themselves in this kind of in the hidden person of the heart. So it's okay. You go back to the Old Testament and look at some of those examples of women like Sarah. In fact, that's the example we're going to get to in a minute. And some of these women of the Old Testament, they were adorned with the hidden person of the heart. But how were they adorned with that? Look at verse 5 again. For in this manner, in former times, the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. So what he just said is the way that they were adorned with it was by submission. And you want a case in point of that? Here's an example of someone adorned with the hidden person of the heart. Verse 6, "As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are if you do good and are not afraid with any terror." And so what he says is that you want to be adorned how the holy women of old were adorned, how women like Sarah were adorned. And how were they adorned? With that hidden person of the heart, it was by being submissive to their own husbands. And then submission shows a trust in God. Verse 5 again. "For in this manner, in former times, the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands." It shows a trust in God. So what's the role of a wife? Well, first and foremost, it's to be submissive. Number 2, she should respect her husband. Ephesians 5:33. "Nevertheless, ladies, one of you in particular, so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. She shows him respect for his role and what he does as the leader, as the head of the household. She is to love him, Titus 2 and in verse 4, that they may admonish young women to love their husbands and to love their children. So she has a love for him. And then she's a homemaker, Titus 2 and in verse 5. To be discreet, chaste homemakers. There's nothing wrong. There's been some thought in times past that it was wrong for a woman to work outside the home. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But her first and foremost responsibility is to be a keeper or a homemaker. A keeper of the home or a homemaker. And that's part of her God-given role that he gives in Titus chapter 2 and in verse 5. Just as she is to love her husband and her children, she is to so be a homemaker and a keeper of the home. What's the picture of the home painted by God? Well, it involves one man, it involves one woman for life. It involves a husband who is a leader, a husband who loves his wife, who dwells with understanding and gives her honor, a wife who submits to her husband, who respects her husband, who loves her husband as a homemaker. It involves children who, first and foremost, obey their parents. Go to Ephesians chapter 6. You say, okay, so now I know the role of the husband and I know the role of the wife. What if there's children in the relationship? What if there's children in the household? Well, there's responsibilities given to children. Ephesians 6 and in verse 1, children, obey your parents. So there's a responsibility for children when they're under the roof of their parents, while they're under their parents' guidance, they are to be obedient. By the way, Ephesians 6 and in verse 1, I think this is something important that for children to understand. Ephesians chapter 6 and in verse 1 is not a suggestion. Ephesians 6 and in verse 1 is a command. Children, obey. And when one has children that reach the age of accountability and respond in obedience to the gospel, if those children are not obedient to their parents, they're going to be lost because they have failed to keep the commandment of God. Children, obey your parents. But not only that, there's a responsibility to honor. Look at verse 2 of Ephesians 6. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. Now, the word honor can have two possible meanings. It can mean to honor, to have honor, to revere, to have an honor, to revere or venerate, Thayer says. So the idea of honor can mean to revere or show honor to your parents. That's part of it. Children, when you're in the household of your parents, show honor to them. Children, when you're out of the household, you still have a responsibility to show them honor. I've used this illustration before. When I was growing up in my parents' house and they told me to do something, I needed to do it because God commanded that I be obedient. Now, if you go back to your parents' household and they ask you to do something, you don't have the same responsibility to be obedient, but you might do it because you honor and you love and you respect them. There's an honor that's given. But honor is not just simply to revere or to show honor. Honor can mean to estimate or to fix the value of something belonging to oneself. Go to Mark 7. I mentioned this the other day. Honor doesn't just involve that we show them honor. Honor also involves that if the time comes that they need us to care for them, that we care for them. We provide for them and care for them as they have provided and cared for us as we were growing up. Go to Mark 7 in verse 9 beginning. He said to them, all too well you reject the commandment of God that you may keep your tradition. He's been rebuking the Pharisees. Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees for and some of the scribes, for setting aside God's commandments to keep traditions. All too well you reject the commandment of God that you may keep your traditions. For Moses said, honor your father and mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. Okay, so he's just talking about the same thing. It's from the Ten Commandments that Paul is talking about in Ephesians 6. Honor your father and mother. But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is Corban, that is a gift to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father and his mother. And so Jesus takes and says that word honor has to do, in a sense, with a physical responsibility or a monetary responsibility to care for them as they're needed, as they get older. And so he says you're taking what you could have used to honor your parents and provide for them, and instead what you're doing now is saying, well, it was given to God, and now you set aside the commandment of God. So when Mark 7, Jesus takes and makes application of it in the sense of taking care of your parents and not just showing honor. Both are necessary. Both are part of the command. And so children in the home need to be obedient to their parents, and they need to honor their parents. And that responsibility to honor goes beyond when we have a household of our own. That command to obey is only as we are in their household, right? Because when one goes out on their own, as is pointed out, you leave father and mother and are joined to his wife. That relationship changes. It's not the same. But the command to honor always remains. Finally, the picture of the home painted by God involves parents who first and foremost raise their children. Raise their kids instead of letting the kids raise themselves. Our society is full of just letting kids sort of tend to themselves and do what they want and let them take care of themselves. And there's not a whole lot of parenting going on anymore. What the proverb writer said in Proverbs 22:6 is, train up a child in the way he shall go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. That has to be some training. I'll let you in on a secret. Children do dumb things. If we leave children to themselves, they're going to do whatever they want to do. They're going to make some really dumb decisions. Because children have to be taught and children have to be trained. Our society would have us think that we can just let children tend to their own devices and we'll just kind of guide them maybe here or there as needed. No, there needs to be some raising of children. If children are not raised, not trained by their parents, not taught by their parents, then you end up with a society that looks, well, an awful lot like our society. What does that training involve? Well, it involves not provoking them to anger first and foremost, Ephesians 6 and verse 4. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. Now, I said this on Wednesday when we were studying Ephesians 6. That does not mean your kids never get mad at you. If you're disciplining your children are going to get mad at some point. Sometimes when they get mad because you're doing your job right. But we're not trying to make them mad. We're trying to teach. We're trying to guide. We're trying to train. So the decisions are not made to provoke them to wrath. You're not trying to provoke them to anger. But instead, you're trying to raise them up into training and instruct them in the way of the Lord. Look at Ephesians 6:4. And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. That word training, it means the act of providing guidance for responsible living, upbringing, training, instruction. Are literal chiefly as it is attained by discipline or correction. We talked about that the other day. If you have an English Standard Version, I know, some others I think do as well, it uses the word discipline. It's the same word that we're going to come and look at in a little bit in Hebrews when we talk about discipline that is rendered chasten in the New King James in Hebrews chapter 12. So it has to do with providing guidance for their upbringing, and that would involve discipline as well. And then instruction, that's counsel about avoidance or cessation of an improper course of conduct, admonition, instruction. That's teaching them. Here's how I put it Wednesday. I'll put it this way again. Training and instruction involve telling them what's wrong and disciplining them when they do it, and then telling them what's right and how they need to live. Those two things are necessary. You've got to tell them what's wrong and discipline them if they don't listen. But then you've got to tell them what's right and how to live. We can't just tell them, here's what you don't do, here's how you need to live. The picture of the home painted by God involves parents who raise their children instead of letting the children raise themselves, who don't provoke their children to anger, who train and instruct them, and finally they discipline their children. Discipline is something that our society would have us think is a bad thing. It's a bad thing to use the rod. But in reality, the rod is done from love. He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly or early. Those that have had children, you know what it is. You don't like to spank your children. That's not fun. But you do it because you want them to learn what's right. And there's got to be some consequences when they do what's wrong. And it's not done because of hatred, and it's not done to be seeming as an abusive parent. It's what God said needs to be done, and it's done out of love. It's something that gives wisdom. Proverbs 29:15. The rod and rebuke, or the rod and reproof gives wisdom. But listen to this. But a child left to himself, that's what our society wants. But a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. So instead of living in himself, there needs to be rod and reproof. Now, there's two sides of that, the rod and reproof. The rod is the discipline. That may be spanking with a hand. That may be as they get bigger using a belt. That may mean when they get to the point that spankings aren't very effective, taking away a cell phone or taking away a car or taking away some privilege. It may be any number of things, but that's the rod. It has to hurt. Okay, it's not used as an abuse, but the punishment has to hurt. That's the rod. But then there's rebuke or reproof. That's some instruction. What if every time a kid did something, we spanked them, but we never told them what they did wrong? They don't know what they're getting a spanking for. They may have thought they may be running through their mind any number of possibilities. But what if they do something and you say, you see that right? Don't do that again. And then you spank. There's a rod, but you know what else was involved? There was some reproof. And so the two together gives wisdom. This is one of my favorite passages. Proverbs 23:13. Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. You shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell. You remember what it's like getting a spanking as a kid? Sometimes we act like we're dying. It's the end of the world. Discipline doesn't kill them. In fact, what discipline does is save them from eternal death. It can help deliver their soul from hell or Sheol. It drives folly from the heart of a child. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, Proverbs 22:15. The rod of correction will drive it far from him. You want to drive folly out of the heart of a child? Use a rod. And finally, it's done for their benefit. It's not done out of hate. It's done out of love. It's done to give them wisdom. It's not going to kill them, but instead it's driving folly from their heart, and it's done for their benefit. Look at Hebrews 12 as we come to a close. Hebrews 12. This passage is talking about chastening from the Lord, but he parallels that with the chastening that parents give to children. And here's what he says. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of the spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. There's benefit in the chastening from the Lord, but let me tell you, fathers discipline as they see fit for the profit and the benefit of the children. Now, no chastening seems joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Again, it's talking about discipline from the Lord, or chastening from the Lord. But the point still holds. Children, you may look back to when you were growing up and say, you know what, I did not enjoy the discipline that my parents gave me. It hurt. I didn't understand it. Why did they give it? And you may look back now and say, you know what, I'm glad they did it because it made me who I am today. And it's a benefit. And it may not be joyful for the present, but painful. But it can yield good fruit. That is the picture of the home painted by God. It's a home that involves one man and one woman for life. With a husband who's the head, who loves of his wife, who loves her, who dwells with understanding and gives honor to her. It involves a wife who submits to her husband, who respects him, loves him, and is a homemaker. It involves children who obey and honor their parents, and parents who raise the children instead of letting the children raise themselves, who don't provoke their children to wrath, but train and instruct them, and they can do that use the rod. That is the picture of the home painted by God. That's not the picture society wants of a home. Society would have us think that the home should look like something else. But it doesn't matter what they think. It doesn't matter the picture they want to draw. That's the picture that God has painted of the home. And all that matters is not that our home looks like the painting of the world, but if we took a picture of our home and you could look at the inside of it, and I mean, you can look not at the inside of your house, but the inside of whether is he a loving husband? Is she a submissive wife? Are they good, and you look at it, it better look like the picture painted by God. Because ultimately, if it's not, here's the consequence of that. Go over to 1 Peter 3 as we close. 1 Peter 3 and in verse 7 as we close. 1 Peter 3 and in verse 7 it says, Husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, give an honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. Do you know how your home life will affect your spiritual life? Maybe you've heard this statement before. I know many that have heard this statement. I haven't heard it personally from anybody, but I've heard of others that made this statement. He's a good Christian, but he's a lousy husband or a lousy father. She's a good Christian, but a lousy wife, or they're lousy. That can't be. If our home does not fit the picture of the home painted by God, then we're not in a right relationship with God, and there's consequences if we don't change. And so we need to make sure that our home looks like the picture of the home painted by God. It may be as we come to a close this morning that there may be one or more present who may have never responded in obedience to the gospel. If you're here and you've heard the word of God and you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, who not repent of your sins, confess your faith in Him, and be buried in the waters of baptism, rise and walk in the newness of life, having your sins forgiven, having the hope of heaven when life on earth is over. Maybe you're here and you've done that, but you say, somewhere along the line I've not been as faithful as I needed to be. If it's a sin of a private nature, you can take us to the Lord privately in prayer, but if it's a sin of a public nature, you would desire the prayers of the congregation. We will gladly pray with you and for you for God to forgive you. No matter what your need is, if we can assist you in any way, which not come forward right now, so together we stand and as we sing.